You may remember it as one of the last strongholds of Ukrainian resistance when Russia made its assault on Kyiv, nearly a year ago now. It was partly occupied in the early stages of the war. The first photo is from 2015. It's a bird's eye shot of a normal-looking town. Green trees surrounding modest houses, with a busy commuter bridge running over a meandering river. It looks European, definitely. The second photo is from 2022. But it looks like it's from a different century. There is a mess of rubble, gap-toothed holes where people's houses once were. Cars are blacked out and mangled, and the bridge is a splintered, fractured wreck. It's not somewhere I recognize.
The damage that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine's infrastructure has been devastating. It's probably the most visceral sign of the war. People have been left without homes. Monuments and buildings are surrounded by sandbags or else damaged and destroyed. But in those sandbags, you can see another thing: hope. Because even while the war continues, across the country, individuals are safeguarding their homes with what they can and beginning the huge task of rebuilding Ukraine. To start this week's episode, we wanted to hear from two of them.
Борис, дякую дуже, що знайшли час для нас.
Дякую, що запросили. Добрий день.
Доброго дня. Boris Dorogov is the CEO of Balbek Bureau, an interior architecture studio he co-founded in Kyiv with his partner Slava Balbek. Mention Balbek to any young Ukrainian and they will recognize the name. These guys built some of my favorite spaces in the country. In March 2022, Balbek's team decided to help the rebuilding effort with a social initiative they call Re-Ukraine. They have loads of different projects across the country, one of which involves building temporary shelters for IDPs, or internally displaced people.
There are already several temporary living quarters were built in Ukraine since 2014. They were mostly built from the shipment containers, which are limited in order to easily transport them. So we decided that we need to improve somehow the person's state of mind, also to keep their dignity, even if they're in such circumstances like we have right now. Doing that project as a completely new approach to temporary living, because first of all comes comfort, not the materials which can be transported by the roads. The project started develop very quickly, and now we started to build the pilot project near Kyiv in Bucha, which will give lodging for 15 families.
Your guys' catchphrase with this project is dignity no matter what. And I'm glad you mentioned it, that, kind of socialization and comfort is a key part of what you guys are trying to do. How exactly does that look like in practice?
First of all, we keep the person's space in a comfortable way. It is wide enough to put the bed. It is wide enough to put a normal window, normal doors.
So you're not trying to crunch 100 people in a small space. You're just trying to build it normally from the beginning.
Yeah. The second thing, we built lots of community spaces and lots of sharing spaces. And those sharing spaces are not shared bathrooms. These are common spaces like a big kitchen with big tables, which is also transformable to different functions, which will help people to integrate into different societies.
Before any of Boris's new designs can be implemented, the decaying structures have to be dealt with. The remnants of war need to be wiped clean. Balbek are not the only people involved in the rebuilding effort. Other teams of volunteers are coming together to start the process themselves, like Andriy Kopelenko, the co-founder of the charity organization District 1. To start off, I'd like to ask you, before the full-scale invasion, what was District 1 doing?
District 1 was organized in 2018, but till 2020, we created events in Ukraine for rebuilding some streets. And only after full escalation of the war, we decided to start again our project, but in other way.
Before the war, District 1 were reviving Kyiv's urban ecosystem, but their urban regeneration pivoted after the full-scale invasion to something much more pragmatic. Can Can you tell us a little bit about the current projects that you're doing?
In the first 2 weeks and maybe 1-2 months, we trying to clean streets, clean some buildings, trying to cover up for rain, for snow or something like that. In the start of summer, we understood that we need to collect more money for rebuilding, because if people don't have a roof, it's not so good when we are just cleaning up. We need to rebuild their buildings. And now we are building 26 buildings in Chernihiv region. We already built 3 buildings in Kyiv region, private houses for families. Also rebuilding big apartment house for 70 apartments. Rebuilding 55 houses, which not totally destroyed. We just rebuilding.
Can you tell me a little bit about what that first project looked like? Like, how did you organize it?
First day was really interesting, because when we understood that we can go to Kyiv region, we organized all meetings with local governments and understood they can give us a chance to go and help them, because not everybody can go in the occupied territories in first days.
And just for context, the reason why you couldn't go there before is that there were a lot of Russian troops around there. So we're talking about the moment after they had been expelled and it was possible for civilians to access those regions.
A lot of mines, a lot of bombs. And first our weeks, we worked exactly with military, with soldiers. They show us, it was like a square where you can go. And they said that in this part of Hostomel, you can work with volunteers, with civilian people, because it's clear, with no bombs, no dangerous objects in this part. And we cleaned that up. But in some weeks, we understood by ourselves how to organize this work, how to work with local government, with military, how to deliver these volunteers in this region. It's one of the most important part of our job, because it's like psychologist help for them, because they was in occupation territory for 30 days, for example, and it's really difficult to be in this situation. And after that, when they saw us, they understand that, oh my God, we are not alone. We can live our life after this crazy situation.
Rebuilding homes and fixing infrastructure is the first step in rebuilding Ukraine from the ground up. But as well as reconstruction, things need to be preserved. Another social initiative from Baalbek seeks to protect Ukraine's monuments from harm. You've probably seen the photos of statues in Kyiv surrounded by sandbags, cultural artifacts of huge significance to Ukraine's national identity, all covered in scaffolding and wrapped in plastic.
So to continue the legacy of the monuments underneath, the coverings also include images of the monument itself and a QR code leading to their Wikipedia page. It's protecting them, all while keeping their symbolic resonance alive for all to see. And then you're not only shielding monuments, you're also making a memorial in Irpin. Tell us about that place and why it's important.
There is a bridge in Irpin which was destroyed during the war. It was destroyed by explosion and some cars fallen down to the river. Some parts of bridge also fell down to the riverbed. It reminded the broken bone to Slava, and it was his initiative to make from it a monument. The idea was to make some landscaping which will allow people to look at it from different points, but to keep that architecture, that wound of Ukrainian earth open to view, and that's the main idea.
Those photos I mentioned of my hometown? Well, Baalbek are making the splintered bridge into a monument. The bridge, which connects my home with Kyiv, was destroyed on February 25th, 2022, by Ukrainian forces to prevent Russia from entering the capital. Baalbek's monument will leave the fracture as it is, with a platform to view it, immortalizing its memory as an object of resistance against war and Russian aggression. These small-scale rebuilding efforts, whether of people's homes, monuments, or memorials, are about returning the Ukrainian people's dignity. They're indelibly linked to the reconstruction of a national identity. Here is Andriy again.
I see that our project now created a really huge community. We know that maybe 50 organizations in Ukraine, they're trying to make something like we are doing. And for us, it's really good. We love that people seeing what we are doing and trying to do it by themselves, because government can't do everything. Now for government, the most important thing is the war. We understand that only civilian people can help themselves in civilian life.
What about the reactions of the people who have moved back into some of the rebuilt areas? Is there any sort of typical messages that you hear, things that they're saying?
They're always crying. For them, it's hope for new life. They didn't expect that they can go back to their home in 2 months. And when we are giving them this chance, it's the most important thing. It's like energy of our organization, of our people who are working with us. All of them saying that only one thing which helps us working every day without vacation, without holidays. You are understanding that your life, it's not only yours. When you're working with charity organization, you need to help other people.
The work of rebuilding Ukraine is already happening at a granular level. But amid the talks of a Marshall Plan for rebuilding Ukraine's economy or a Green New Deal from the West, putting things back together in the here and now needs to come from Ukrainians themselves. It needs to be owned by Ukraine and be seen to be owned by Ukraine. Even in the midst of war, the first steps towards this have already begun.
From Message Heard and the Kyiv Independent, you're listening to Power Lines, from Ukraine to the world.
In this series, we're going to be mapping the undercurrents and global consequences of the war in Ukraine, beginning in Kyiv and following the roads out wherever they may lead. I'm Jakub Parushinsky.
And I'm Anastasia Lopatina. This week, we're beginning a two-parter to end our first series, looking at how Ukraine is being rebuilt, both now and following the war. And today, we're focusing on infrastructure and the economy, two things which have been really devastated by the Russian full-scale invasion.
Yes, so one thing which has been really interesting economically, on the one hand, it's been really interesting and inspiring to see how durable and resistant the Ukrainian economy has been.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the situation back to February of last year, Russia launched this all-out war against Ukraine, not just the tanks rolling in, across Ukraine's borders, the troops landing and all of that, but also cyber warfare against its infrastructure, its banking system. There's been attacks on its economy, shipments that couldn't go out through different Ukrainian ports. And it's almost surprising how resistant the Ukrainian economy has been. So the hryvnia has held up. It's devalued a little bit, but it has held since. The central bank reserves are holding up. The country is continuing to function.
So what you're saying is it could have been significantly worse.
Absolutely. So Ukraine's GDP dropped by about a third. And when you look at the forecasts from the first days of the full-scale invasion, they were actually much more grim.
Interesting.
They expected to be a complete collapse. And Ukraine has held. And it has held in a very impressive way.
And is that because of all of the foreign aid that we're getting? Because I know that, the monthly payments that we get that is the money that we essentially use to pay all the salaries. That's how we keep the government functioning. It looks like we would literally collapse without it.
Absolutely. There's, 5 billion a month that is sort of coming in to keep Ukraine afloat. But even that in itself isn't enough to keep the economy going, right? That replenishes the central bank reserve. It covers for the drop in tax revenues because obviously, a lot of businesses have been shut. A lot of people have moved out. Their real earnings have dropped. But, even with that money, it's not an easy task. And Ukraine has performed admirably. But the challenge ahead is kind of insane if you think about it.
I just don't even really know how to talk about it because it's just so big. And I'm actually a bit worried about this rethinking process because this is gonna also need to happen on a large scale, right? All of these buildings that have been destroyed, many of them are terrible looking and just like completely non-functional. And the way we rebuild them is going to have to be by modern standards. And I'm really interested in what that's going to look like. To dig into all of this a bit deeper, this week we both did interviews with two really top economists from both Ukrainian and international perspectives. Let's start with you, Jakub. Who did you speak to?
Yeah, so I spoke with Ivan Miklos, a Slovakian politician and former Minister of Finance. So Ivan has been a driver of this sort of program of liberalization and transformation for Slovakia, which worked extremely well and sort of turned it in what was then called the Tatra Tiger, this kind of booming economy. Since leaving politics in Slovakia, he spent about 5 years advising the Ukrainian government, actually working with the Ministry of Finance and other positions. And today he's working with Ukraine's National Recovery Council as they plot a route forward towards the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. So he was actually pretty perfectly placed to answer my questions about what needs to happen in order for Ukraine to have a successful recovery. You're now working with the National Recovery Council. I know that you have looked a lot at reform in Ukraine and what this means in terms of the future EU integration. What does your current work at the National Recovery Council look like?
Yeah, generally speaking about what is the today's situation regarding reforms and integration, because this is very important, that successful post-communist countries have been successful not only because reforms, but also because integration. EU integration. And these processes are interconnected, of course. And now it is first good news. Of course, war is terrible, is bad news, is tragic. But maybe paradoxically, some things are, especially will of the Ukrainians, Ukrainian nation to be unified, to really have strong will to be part of the Western society, and to support necessary changes, necessary reforms now is stronger than it was before. And integration, the candidate status, is very, very important, which means on one side it is more difficult situation because the costs of the war and direct and indirect damage is impossible to even count. Some material damage, but on the other side, I hope and I think that this unity, this will and this courage, not only to win in a fight, in war, but also to change the country and to rebuild country, not the same as it was before war, but as really new, the country is very, very, very strong. Without financial support, it couldn't be possible to hold macroeconomic stability in such, surprisingly strong level as it is during last year, for instance, during war year. It is, of course, difficult to say that war could have some positive side, but there are some aspects which is very, very important to use in speeding up necessary reforms, necessary changes.
Looking forward a bit, let's say hypothetically the war ends in a couple of months. How do we rebuild Ukraine? What were the things that are really sort of critical, the key elements for you to essentially rebuild the country?
Yeah, there are a lot of things, but one thing is even important precondition before speaking about economic dimension, to speak about how war will end. And this is the key, because only a real end of the war, which will not create more problems than solutions, is that Ukraine have to return to its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and Donbas and Luhansk. Because if not, I'm afraid that it will be any kind of bad compromise will be the source of so big instability and tensions inside Ukraine, that outside Ukraine as well, but especially inside Ukraine, that it couldn't be possible in these conditions to really successfully rebuild and reconstruct the country. This is my deep conviction after spending 5 years in Ukraine, and after, I think, knowing and feeling the atmosphere and the society.
Could you say a bit more about the reasons for this instability? What would be the problems? Because So, for example, right now, part of the integration process is essentially adopting EU legislation. Part of it is about rebuilding roads. What would be the sources of this instability?
The main source of instability will be that today, by public opinion polls, majority, almost 90% of Ukrainians are strongly supporting and strongly convinced that Ukraine has to return to its internationally recognized borders. And any bad compromise could create so big dissatisfaction and frustration among people, especially among those who lost their friends, their family members. It could create a lot of tensions and problems, which means politically, bad compromise and sacrificing some part of territory, for instance, will create a lot of tensions inside of the society, because people simply don't want to accept that changing borders, their own country's borders by force, is acceptable and can be acceptable even.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how many veterans and people affected somehow by war will be after this war? How many weapons will be among people? How huge could be this dissatisfaction, and how strong could be this emotion if they will feel that their losses and everything was for nothing, or at least they will see that it was politicians finally accepted some defeat and some bad compromise. I'm deeply convinced that this emotion is, and it will be very, very strong. And that's the reason why necessary precondition for stability, not only in Ukraine, but even much broader, even internationally, even in the global scale, why it is important that Putin will be defeated and Ukraine will win and will be able to return to its internationally recognized border.
I think this point that Ivan brought up is really, really crucial, especially with the scale of involvement that Ukrainians have with active hostilities now. And by that, I mean that, our veterans are not, a few dozen thousand people. I think the amount of people in our society that have either actively participated in war or have family members who've done so is a huge, huge number. So if that group has some sort of overwhelming feeling of discontent after whatever peace plan we agree on comes through, that's really going to be a problem. And it is not only a problem morally, because of course we want to respect the effort and the sacrifice that these amazing people have done, but also I think politically it will be, because it's probably pretty obvious, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of those veterans perhaps are going to aim for certain level of political power. Like, I think we've seen this in 2014, right? That people who were actively involved in the revolution, for example, or in Donbass, they then went on to pursue political interest, which is fair. So if that happens and there is conflict, I think that's going to be really problematic, and it's just going to cause more instability. And that's not something that we need at all.
You're absolutely right. I think the way that Ukraine ends up reintegrating, working with its veterans is going to be absolutely critical for the future of the country. What I mean is, you look at societies that are heavily militarized, Israel, the US, having a pathway and sort of having bridges between the army and the private sector and the political various initiatives, the civic sector. This is essentially something that will make or break the future of Ukraine, right?
Yeah, I agree.
So how the country deals with that, it's really important.
This also just really highlights why we can probably say for sure that if we do concede any territory, it will be some sort of en masse upheaval.
I mean, massive resentment is a very dangerous thing for Ukraine. But I'd argue that even sort of thinking from the perspective of conceding territory, it's sort of starting from the wrong place. Because whatever happens, the truth is that the current people in power in Russia, and I'm not talking about just Putin, this is going several levels down the line at the very least, see Ukraine as an enemy state that they need to destroy, right? So even if Ukraine reconquers all of its territory tomorrow, they're still planning to reinvade, right? Like nothing changes for them.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
And whether
that's
it's 5 years'
true.
time, 10 years' time. So I'd almost argue that like if you concede territory now, well, you're just making it, you're just sort of easing them into the next war.
Yeah.
But even if you don't concede any territory, essentially what you want to portray is that you're kind of, it's a little bit like in business negotiations where you essentially tell the other party, I'm crazy, right? Like this is my red line. And if you do even a small thing to sort of go beyond my red line, I will react disproportionately. They need to say, look, any sort of additional kind of attempt to coerce Ukraine is going to be met with disproportional reactions because you want to stave off the next war, right? Which will come. Now, Nastya, you also spoke to another guest this week, right?
I did, because as well as that international perspective, we also wanted to hear from someone in Ukraine. So I was really lucky to sit down with Timofey Milovanov. Timofey is another economist who works across some of the highest positions in the Ukrainian civil society and government. He's the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, currently an advisor to the Zelensky administration, and previously the Minister of Economy in Ukraine from 2019 to 2020. Now, Ivan mentioned that assessing the material damage of buildings and infrastructure in Ukraine is a really difficult task, impossible even. So I asked Timofey about this and how the government in Ukraine are beginning to calculate the material cost of this war.